This programme was produced at and first aired on MPR, Manawatu People's Radio, with support from New Zealand On Air. Ka pai Irarangi Tamotu, MPR.
Kia ora and welcome to Reserved Recommendations, a show about problematic faves, great trash, difficult art, and our complex relationship with art and entertainment. My name's Hugh, I'm the host, and I'd like to put in a very mild content warning for this show as a whole. Sometimes our recommendations on this show are reserved just because the thing that we're discussing is in some way not good. But sometimes there are aspects to the art or artist that may be confronting for some people. Read the episode descriptions for more information and do be aware of your listening environment.
Kia ora and welcome to Reserved Recommendations. This is a show about great trash and complicated relationships with art and culture. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you all again my brother Gus, coming direct from not sunny at the moment because it's like nighttime in winter, Glasgow. How's it going, Angus? How are you doing?
Yeah, it's going quite well. We are, as you say, it is dark outside. It was quite sunny today, so, you know. And it's Friday. So
Hey!
tell people time. Way.
I mean, it's Saturday morning for us, but, you know, it'll be Thursday night when people hear this. So time,
What is time?
It is a flat circle and all of those things.
My general response to people asking me how I'm feeling these days during the pandemic is, what is time? How are birds?
Yep. The shrug does not translate beautifully on radio, but I will explain that it existed. So
Yeah.
the thing that you wanted to talk about is a subject dear to my heart because I am a nerdy person who came of kind of purchasing an independent decisions age in the mid to late 90s, and that is the world of darkness. So before we get into any recommendations you might have and why those would be reserved, do you want to just maybe like explain the rough pitch of the world of darkness, and I can sort of chip in as well, because I think one of the things about the world of darkness, which is a role-playing setting, so there's a reservation right off the start. If you're not into tabletop role-playing, this is going to get super nerdy. You might want to skip this one, but one of the things about the world of darkness, I think, is that it has a very interesting historical position in terms of tabletop game design, because it fits in a kind of like hinge point in terms of what games try to do. But I will let you kind of give the rundown.
That's entirely true. Okay, so I'm going to start like at even baser levels very quickly and do I used to run a role-playing society pitch for what a role-playing game is. For those people who are not on board or only really know that Dungeons and Dragons existed at some point, and there was that awful movie with Tom Hanks, ?
Yeah, he was the one like the mazes and monsters, but there was also another awful movie actually set in Dungeons and Dragons which didn't have him.
Yeah. What role-playing is it is a collaborative storytelling experience. So a bunch of people turn up around a table. Usually there is somebody who is representing the world, and then everybody else takes up a character in that world, and then together, usually using some sort of system and representing the randomness of the world and the ability to do things with dice or some other randomizer, people tell a collaborative story. Why I want to talk about World of Darkness? Well, there's two reasons. Let's be absolutely honest and upfront very clearly. Both me and Hugh are massive nerds for it, and it was very central in our youth. But secondly, I think it's a really interesting lens to see role-playing games and the kind of growth that role-playing games in general have had to go through in their 30-something years of mainstream existence. So why World of Darkness is really interesting for that is, and we're talking about that rather than say something like Dungeons and Dragons, which is much more well known, is because World of Darkness is a shared universe. It is a gothic punk setting. So the kind of pitch is it is like our world, but darker. There are things in the shadows.
And so I've been watching a thing on Netflix which has been giving me thoughts about the Our World But Darker, because that's a thing that's always slightly bothered me about World of Darkness, is they have this like Our World But Worse thing. And often the source books attempt to explain that as everyone's a little bit meaner and nastier. But I've been watching Hannibal. And if people have not are not au fait with Hannibal, it's the TV series based on the books that also gave rise to Silence of the Lambs and so on and so forth. It's got Mads Mikkelsen doing probably the sexiest Hannibal Lecter. And the thing about Hannibal that I think is illustrative for this is that it's got this real focus on taking awful things and presenting them like beautiful sculptures. And so it's not like CSI where serial killers are kind of like sad, tortured people. This is an alternate fantasy where serial killers have kind of transcended to a different aesthetic and moral plane and have their own logic. And you'll get these utterly gorgeous shots of like corpses amalgamated into an enormous totem pole on a beach at sunrise, or someone's exhumed a dozen bodies and combined them to create a statue of the god Shiva, or like it's all at this really heightened, and the darkness is heightened, but it's heightened in a very aesthetic way, kind of tone. And I think that that's sort of illustrative for like why you would want Our World But Worse. I mean, it's worse in a Hannibal like Batman sense.
Yeah, no, I think that's entirely correct. And I was kind of doing some quick reading and research for this episode, and looking at what people were saying critically. So the first game, Vampire the Masquerade, was released in 1991. And one of the comments that lots of people have about why they were so striking was just the art style of the books, and the aesthetic going through the books in the kind of art and production styles seemed to strike a lot of people. But, you know, goth was on the rise. There's a sort of weird 90s nihilism, which I've never really been able to clarify better than that. But I mean, to tie it into other things that were happening at the time, Buffy and things like that are also running the same sort of weird nihilism where everybody is having a good time and hanging out and being teenagers, but we're all doomed. We know we're all doomed. We're not going to win, but boy, is it fun right now, right? We are kids at high school. I mean, in Buffy's case, we're kids at high school and doing high school things, but we're all doomed because there's like a hellmouth or something underneath. And the other thing which is really notable about World of Darkness is they were often something like D&D is very much system first. You have a system. It's about strategy. It's often very much about strategy. It's about how things are done. You need to have a plan. World of Darkness was striking because it was concept first, and system seemed to be about 7th on the list.
Yeah, I mean, to the point where I have a continuing argument with the World of Darkness system, which, I mean, now is as good a place as any to vent my spleen on that particular thing, because I think, well, I mean, you know, we can get back into this as a reservation, but in some ways the system 7th approach actually even started to hamper the storytelling. The most obvious way that is true is that your various different kind of things that you could be. So starting with, it started with vampires, but the game's expanded to include werewolves and people who are also fairies and ghosts and wizards and all sorts of things. And in all of those cases, those people have, or those entities have special powers, and those special powers tie back to their ordinary qualities. So in order to use your super werewolf power, you will make a dice roll that is related to your physical strength, perhaps, or your capacity to do academics, or like they all work like that. But the storytelling concept focus leads to a way of building your character which would set you to define what all of those things were first for character reasons, and then pick what kind of abilities that you wanted. And the abilities are, they're part of the story. Do you want to be a vampire who is fast? Do you want to be a vampire who does mind control? Do you want to be a vampire who can turn into bats? All of those are classic vampire-y things to do and would reflect on your character. But if you do things the way that they tell you to do them, you will be bad at all of the things that you have chosen to do, because you actually do need to take that Dungeons and Dragons-y system focus approach in order to make those things actually effective.
And so I think this is a really good point to leap back to one of the things you opened with, which is it's a very interesting thing to view a crux. And so hold on to your hats, folks. We're about to get super nerdy. There was a deep overriding kind of internal flame war and fight that happened mainly on Usenet, just to date when that was. And if you don't know what Usenet is, it doesn't matter. So back in the days, there were battle lines drawn on the internet, as it were, between the role monsters and the basket weavers. And what basically the decision, the argument became was role-playing games as a thing had grown out of tabletop war games. They had become more and more complex and overarching, and then at some point people had decided you didn't really need the little figures and the terrain on the table anymore. You could just tell those stories and roll the dice, and that would be more interesting and more fun. And then people came into that from a kind of improvisational theater basis, or a kind of, oh, you're telling me this is about storytelling and character. That's what I want out of this experience. I'm going to tell a story and be a crazy character and do cool things and be a cool character. And those people, if they ended up in the same group, didn't mesh, and they had this real problem. And one side said, look, you are wasting all of this strategic resource, the points that you get to put on your character sheet, the numbers on your character sheet, by doing things like buying basket weaving. What sort of adventurer needs basket weaving? And the other said, look, you're just focusing on stats on the page, right? You are just trying to make this the most efficient, and that's not fun. And this was a long, complicated fight, and at some point we might delve into like threefold systems and things.
I was going to say, I mean, because this continued on into the Forge, which if people are not aware of the Forge, my sweet summer child, stay that way. But if people are aware of the Forge, I have just sent like chills of ancestral trauma juddering up some spines, because that was a website devoted to game design that became notoriously and overwhelmingly murderously toxic, based on basically evolutions of this same argument that you've just described.
Yeah. And I mean, I think also it's important to note this point, because I'm going to come back to it later when I talk about 5th edition and kind of where we are now in role-playing games in general. But suffice to say, yeah, this is something that lots of paper and ink and digital ink was spilled over, and people got very upsetted. And coming back to World of Darkness, especially Vampire and things like that, those first editions, firstly, there was a very much a go fast and break things response. The Mark
Reinhagen,
there we go, who made them, seemed to make the first edition of each book and then move on to the next creation. So just kind of made something, dropped it into some other people's laps and moved on, which is not a great way to build things. But secondly, they did always feel like they wanted to sit somewhere between those. You can play this with the stats and you can play this for the story. And that tension, that weirdness of trying going, oh, we're all about telling stories, but we've got this robust system that you have to adhere to. Especially like in early Vampire was one of the big problems was. But that being said, I think it was also one of, looking back on it, it's one of its biggest benefits as well, because firstly, it was concept forward. So Vampire's concept is there is a beast in all of us. Or like, it's do not something unless you become a beast.
Oh, no, those who fight monsters must take care lest they also become monsters, gaze not into the abyss.
That's Hunter.
Yes.
Vampire is like something unless beast do not behave like a beast unless beast you become. Right? So the idea is that there is a unquenchable hunger for blood inside you, and if you keep on giving into that, you will give into it. So there's a very strong concept forward, and so if people didn't like how the system worked, they could kind of just, it was so obviously broken and badly designed that you could kind of throw it to the side a lot and just go, but we've got the concept, we understand what this is about, and roll with that.
And I mean, you made the point about the kind of unquenchable beast that you have to balance with. That is a really because you talked about the sense of sort of cynical fatalism tied to the kind of early to mid 90s gothness, and I just want to kind of point out that was a kind of a core part of all of the original first edition games. So Vampire, there is a projected arc for a character, which is that eventually you will lose humanity. Humanity is a trackable score. You will lose it because circumstances will conspire to make you lose your shit, and the consequence of that is losing humanity. As a result of that, you will eventually become a mindless beast and be hunted down by your erstwhile companions because you're too dangerous to live. Werewolves are supernatural warriors who have already lost the war. They lost the war through hubris back in the dawn of time and are still continuing to fight against the forces of corruption out of some misplaced sense of duty. They will all die. Changelings, the fairies, require a sort of psychic resource called banality in order to have an anchor in the human world. But if they have too much of it, then their wings will fall off and turn into little shriveled brown leaves, which, I mean, that's a metaphor. That's not exactly what happens, yeah. But, you know, they will lose their spark. And if they lose that resource, they will fly off into fairy and become unretrievable spirits of madness. The wizards are constantly in tension with essentially magical police force who want to wipe them out, and at the same time the ability to accidentally erase themselves from reality completely because they've overextended their ability to warp the world. You know, like everyone exists in this space where on a long enough timeline they will be eradicated. I forgot to mention the ghosts, the wraiths. The player to your left is your shadow self actively trying to destroy you, and every so often, if you roll bad, they get to be you and make you make the worst decisions for a while.
Entirely, and I think like just because what you just did is one of the reasons why this is such a meaningful thing for such a lot of people, is that you kind of like you can, if you get a lot of World of Darkness nerds in a room, they will talk about all the lore and the superpowers and the way they all mesh together endlessly. And in a way that doesn't seem to come from many other things. And that's just it. Like, so there's a lot of that stuff that pulls people in, I think, for vampires. Firstly, vampires are cool. Right? Vampires are cool. Vampires are sexy. They have been for a while. Anne Rice was big at the time. But once you start reading, you're like, it's very easy to get the ideas, right? Vampire is, and often there were there's a lot of tensions were built into the game. So Vampire is often a game of personal horror because you're a creature who needs to keep connected to humanity, but you also need to eat humans to live. And you have all these cool superpowers, but the first rule is don't let the humans find out about us, or else they'll kill us all. We had one Inquisition; it wasn't great. So you have all these cool superpowers, but you can't tell anybody, and you shouldn't do it in public. So there were all these very cool tensions built into it. There was kind of court politics, which is always very seductive. So I think all of these, like, as I say, like, one of its biggest bonuses and its biggest flaws was this kind of concept forward meta plot shared universe
and
idea.
I want to jump in on the shared universe because one of the things that I really liked about the original World of Darkness, and I don't, this is something we can perhaps talk about when we get to 5th edition and where that is in the first run, and then this continues through the 2nd edition, and then eventually they ended the World of Darkness and restarted a new one. So basically, old World of Darkness before they ended the world. The games were understood to take place in the same world, but whatever game you were playing had its own rules, and those weren't necessarily consistent with everybody else's. So vampires in a werewolf game are quite different from vampires in a vampire game. Werewolves in a vampire game, vice versa. And so, you have this real sense that while like everyone feels like they have the key to reality, and either they are all right in some kind of Alan Moore, Neil Gaiman kind of, reality is subjective, man. I should probably throw Grant Morrison in there as well. 80s British comics way. There is, or they are all incorrect about having the fundamental key to reality, and they've just worked out a thing that's consistent enough that it makes sense to them, and the actual truth is something completely different, and there are all these factions, none of which actually understand each other. And I think that's really cool that while they coexist and you might run into them, they don't, you can't just like translate between them. It's not like an elf and a dwarf having a conversation in Dungeons and Dragons. They live in fundamentally different universes that happen to exist in the same place.
But I think that's also like one of the fascinating things, and again, one of the things that pulled people in and kept them in the World of Darkness canon is like your first game is Vampire, because that was often people's first game. You read the Vampire book and you kind of understand the vampire's view of the world, and then somebody goes, oh, we've also got this werewolf game. Why don't you take that, look at that? And you look at the werewolf game and you go, oh, the thing that the vampires, like, there are kind of kooky magical things. There are spiritual power places that werewolves care about a lot, and they might appear in the vampire books, but called something different. And say that there are magical vampires who do blood magic, and they might be also interested in those sort of spiritual, powerful places, or they can see into the spiritual realm, but they think of them as just ghosts or manifestations of power. While werewolves are like, oh no, those are really important. That's what's important. So you get the two sort, like, one of the things it did very well was that idea of the, like, from this point of view, we are looking at the same world, but we're just pulling out different things. And then you look at the mages and they're like, oh, right, no, this is all like power, magical goo. These spiritual sites the werewolves are interested in aren't spiritual sites. They're just really great places to drink lots of power to do stupid stuff from. And again, firstly, you get all these tensions because everybody has a different understanding of what to do with whatever the resources they are competing over are. But also you get this idea, once you've read one book and you're starting to read another, you can go, oh, wait, but that's that thing. Haha, now I'm on the inside, and you can get these kind of cue the meme of the corkboard with red string all over it sort of moments.
Well, look, I think that is an excellent place to take our halfway break, so we will do that, and we will return very shortly right after this.
Support this show and others like it by giving a donation. For more information, go to www.mpr.nz/donate.
And we're back. You're listening to Reserved Recommendations. This is a show about great trash and complicated relationships with art and culture. I am talking this evening to my brother, Angus, direct from Glasgow, about The World of Darkness. And we've just been really kind of talking about what made the initial concept great. Do you maybe want to shift the discussion a little bit and talk about some of the flaws and reservations with at least the first edition, because that might seg us into talking about where we are now. And I think if you were to direct a modern person who was interested in role-playing games back to the 1991 first editions in particular, but also there's a lot of splats, like expansion books that came out through that first series of World of Darkness as well, which kind of, I think, did they run through 3 editions before they ended the world? I can't remember.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the editions were kind of sporadic across the
yeah, not
various,
everything got as many editions as everything else. But there is some stuff there which to a modern audience would be deeply uncool, and in ways that were not really intended. So that's perhaps a thing that we can get into now.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly the point. Like, firstly, a lot of the gothic horror stuff was done unthinkingly. It was just like, and here's something super horrific. Isn't that cool? Right? Hey, we've done a horrific thing. Let's not think about what that means to players who may have had horrific actual real world horrific experiences. We'll just throw this shit in there and, hey, we're being edgy and cool. And secondly, there are some things like there was a source book called Gypsy. There was various other, like there was that very privileged white guy mentality of the early 90s of just kind of wandering into other people's cultures and going, boy, isn't this a lot of nice source material?
Yeah, for example, Werewolf, for reasons which are like entirely 90s aesthetic, borrows a huge amount of stuff in a really scattershot way from Native American culture, and it is not good.
There is just a lot of not good things that happened. I mean, like, not happened, but just kind of were written without thinking, I think is the fairest way to put it. And I think that also brings us on to, like, more recently, as they have been, what happened was they, the other thing, let's just also take a digression into some of the, they got very, World of Darkness got very big. White Wolf, the publishing company who was responsible for it, did very well off the back of it, and then basically tried as many failed projects as they could possibly imagine. So there was a really awful TV series called Kindred the Embraced. It was, oh boy, it's an experience. There was apparently a bunch of novelizations which just slammed face first into the ground. I assume because if you were into that sort of thing, you were reading Anne Rice or one of her.
It's like the video game movie issue. Like Max Payne is already an adaptation of a sort of melange of hard-boiled movies. Therefore, a movie adaptation of Max Payne becomes an adaptation of an adaptation, and the like photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy effect becomes really pronounced. Like the World of Darkness games, if you look into 90s pop culture, you can see their roots. They were drawing really heavily from the late 80s, early 90s British comics that started going a bit weird. They were drawing a lot from goth culture. They were drawing a lot from kind of mall goth culture. And if you find those things, you will see a lot of direct pointers. So then trying to direct that back into fiction again, that's a big ask to make that in any way effective.
And also, I saw a really good description of one of the big problems, and it came from this great vision and this great meta plot, because they had this story that was happening in this massively connected world, and they were telling it in all of these source books and all these splat books. And one of the comments that I saw going past, and it's really fair, was that was probably part of their downfall, because it was just so tiring. Like if you were super, super invested, then you somehow had to be super invested in this massively spread out meta plot. And again, I think that was one of the things that ended up for a lot of us who grew up playing it, was we didn't really pay attention. I don't know of many people who paid attention to the giant meta plots. And if you talk to people about their kind of experiences playing Vampire, it was often about, we set it in our city. And I guess I should have highlighted this as one of the things that was cool about it, because it was a modern setting, because it was in the current world. You could play in your city. You could have, Glasgow by night. I'm currently running a game for some friends on Zoom, on Discord, which is called Glasgow by Night. We play in Glasgow, but not in the pandemic. And, so there was that, but not many people were kind of attached to the big overarching plot. And so I think the idea of then going off and writing novels about this plot that nobody actually cared about that much became too much inside baseball and probably dropped them. And so the company failed. It was bought by a Icelandic software development company who tried to shift them into a massively multiplayer online RPG. That failed. They got bought by Paradox Interactive, who are very famous if you are a strategy game nerd, famous for Crusader Kings and Europa Universalis, which is the best introduction to European politics you'll ever get. And they started publishing again, at which point and you can kind of read it as trying that 90s shit again, and it just slamming straight into that's not okay anymore, using the the homophobia in Chechnya as a setting trope, and having characters who seem to be repping as both either neo-Nazis or pedophiles, as implied in their character bios, and that was just not good, just absolutely not good. At which point Paradox Interactive basically just took away all of their own oversight and brought them within their own company and started publishing again under Paradox Interactive. So they have tried the same shit again and have now been absorbed into Paradox Interactive.
I think the thing that happened in the intervening time so if you want to give White Wolf the absolute maximum benefit of the doubt, which I don't know that you owe them, to be honest, but if you wanted to do that, then I think the thing that happened in the intervening time is that in 1991, a kind of cynical edginess was the sort of assumed default attitude by teenagers, or at least like by teenagers on the fringe. You can think of a sort of weird kid archetype from 90s TV, and that's who they were pitching at, and that fits with a bunch of other pop culture that existed at the time. That's when Jonan Vasquez was publishing Johnny the Homicidal Maniac, for example, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a comic about a homicidal maniac played for laughs. And there's a cultural context there that makes perfect sense. I'm not saying it's good. I'm just saying it's part of a wider kind of cultural phenomenon, and the edginess wasn't directed in any deliberate way. Like, it probably ended up hurting people, but that wasn't the point of what they were trying to do.
No.
The point at which they tried it again, that kind of edgy, deliberate offensiveness had become a political signifier. And so if you set out to do that, the people that you're going to attract are going to be like Gamergate people, for want of a better term. You know, you're going to attract basically internet Nazis who want an excuse to be bad to women. And I think if you wanted to be as charitable to them as possible, you could say that they failed to understand that cultural transition.
Yeah. And this, I think, is probably a good point to like transition into like why I think they are good now, which is probably in response to that. Paradox Interactive has now released the 5th edition of Vampire the Masquerade. And what is in there is a lot of things which are good and show how far role-playing games have come to a certain degree. So there is a concept now called the Session Zero, which is a session before you even start playing a game. And in that, they specifically in the core rulebook talk about what they call is veils and...
Lines and veils.
Lines and veils. For other people, it's often called hard and soft limits or something akin to that. And that's setting up with your players, having a discussion with the people you're playing with before you start the game about what this game is going to be about, what's okay to happen in the game and what's not okay to happen in the game, and what's we can talk about, but we're just going to kind of fade to black about. We're going to say, and then out comes the power drill, and then we cut away from that scene and we'll talk about it maybe in like system bases, but not in, gory detail.
So that's a thing where you actually sent me to a Session Zero as a thing to watch for a game called Not a Drop to Drink, which you can find on YouTube. And I was really impressed by that because they had this really clear look. We're doing vampire. This is going to be horror. This is specifically personal horror about watching oneself transform into something terrible. But, we don't want to break people's limits. That's not what we're doing here. And so there were lots of like really specific things, which I thought was really interesting. So, one person said, okay, well, look, violence is totally fine. I understand that violence is going to happen as part of this game. Vampires are inherently violent creatures because drinking people's blood is violence. But I don't want to hear any descriptions of violence that involves the breaking of joints. Like, if there are injuries to people's limbs, that's fine. I just don't want to ever hear a description of the breaking of a joint. And I thought that the ability to be like that granular about that stuff is really useful, particularly when you're setting out to do... all of these games are in some way horror games.
Yeah, no, I think that that is a place we have come to as as the role playing community as a general thing, as we now are having an understanding that these, we're telling stories, but stories can also be kind of harmful if people have kind of, if they have trauma which is kicking around there. We want to try as best we can to tell stories which don't re-traumatize people, and to give people ways that they can tap out of stories which are traumatizing them. And on one level, that's really cool because that gives people much more consent about the sort of stories they're in, and much less room for people to go, haha, surprise, here's something horrific. Oh God, you're traumatized. Oh God, what do I do? And on the second side, from somebody who's telling the story's point of view, that gives you much more power to tell much better stories, or much more weird and kooky, or perhaps even more horrific stories. Because if you've got a box within which you can play, then you can go right to the edge of that box carefully and with due diligence, but you can find a way to push yourself to the edge of that box.
And also you can be much more willing to, when you're clear about what kind of threats are personally acceptable to the players, you can be much more threatening to the characters. Because I think that's one of the things that I experienced in the course of playing World of Darkness games, is that in order to create situations which would drive conflict and give the characters something to do, the storyteller, which is the person running the game, would threaten things that belonged to the characters, or threaten the characters in various ways. And some players would find that very unacceptable, and that would cause a lot of problems because it would lead to very divergent goals at the table, and lead to people behaving in quite unconstructive ways that ground stuff to a halt. And so if you have made it clear that you're acceptable, it's acceptable for you to have X, Y, and Z thing happen, but not other things, then you've got a really clear idea of what it's okay for you to threaten. And that might be terrible for the character, but so long as it's acceptable for the player, that's okay.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly it, right? Once, for a long time, there was this kind of conception that, you came to the table, the person running the game came to the table with their binder, their numbers of binder of what the world was and what was happening in the world and what was going to happen. And you kind of either bought in or you didn't come to the next game or whatever. And one of the ways that the World of Darkness shows that kind of people have grown up a bit is there's a much more willingness to accept that this is a cooperative experience, right? Players can buy into the story and say, hey, this is a really cool story. I'm really liking where my character is. What would happen if, they met somebody who offered them this choice, or what would happen if this happened? And yeah.
And so, I mean, the thing that I've been doing is I've been trying to get my butt organized to run a werewolf game for a while now. And I have been reading 2nd edition Werewolf, which is not as advanced as 5th edition Vampire, but it's still heading in that direction. And the thing that struck me about that is that compared to when I bought 1st edition Werewolf, which I should not have done, because the 1st editions of World of Darkness games are always wonky as heck, and you need to wait for the 2nd. But there's a lot more nuance in terms of the ways in which werewolves could interact with the world, and they've created a lot more space for characters to be different kinds of characters. And so they've actually put thought into things like how transness would interact with someone also being a werewolf, or how in this version of Werewolf, they've shifted away from the doomed war narrative to the concept that werewolves' job is to be like they fill an ecological niche. So wolves fill the ecological niche of limiting the numbers of prey animals so that those prey animals can like maintain healthy populations, and werewolves do the kind of psychic spiritual version of that. And they have created a way for werewolves to have a much more nuanced relationship with that world, which is, it's neat that they've kind of gone through and had all of those thoughts rather than leaving it up to the people at the table to figure that out.
Yes, no, entirely. I think, firstly, be aware that I think within a few weeks, the new version of Werewolf will be out. So keep your eyes out for that. But also, yeah, I think there was a much more nuanced approach as those systems went through their evolution and became better and better. Well, not better and better, just as you say, more nuanced and more in touch with maybe, what was at stake in these stories they were telling.
I mean, the system is also better. Everything now runs on the new World of Darkness system, which is the one thing that the World of Darkness genuinely 100% improved between ending the old World of Darkness and creating the new one. It's much easier to understand, and there are a lot of little kind of subsystems which are not quite interesting enough for us to go into, but just there's a lot of ways in which stuff is faster, and the maths works more in the way that it was intended to work. One of the problems with the original World of Darkness was that you could roll a big handful of dice because you were really good at doing things. Being better at things means roll more dice, but because of the way the maths stacked up, that could actually end up cancelling itself out and not making as much of a difference as they had intended for it to make. And they have fixed that in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and I think, that was one of the other things that was very striking about the 5th edition Vampire is that just the system is so much cleaner, right? Again, not in many ways to dive into here, but a lot of the things which are very interesting is the way that systems can show you what is happening in the world. And one of the things in Vampire is hunger. So that hunger is something that slowly, in 5th edition, slowly takes over your ability to do things. So your dice pools become more and more filled with hunger dice. And therefore, you're still as good as what you were doing, at doing what you were doing before, but there's a higher chance that things go horrifyingly wrong in there. And things like, one of the things that was always terrible in the World of Darkness, because it wasn't very polished in the system department, was combat. Just because it dragged on. And within these editions, you have the introduction of the 3-roll rule, which is the idea of that you just, if you've got a big complex situation, boil it down to 3 things, right? The start of a conflict, the middle of the conflict, the sort of peak of it, and the last bit, and have those 3 things be meaningful. But that's it, like it's 3 and out. You do 3 rolls at the maximus, no matter how complicated the situation is. 3 rolls, and then you're out. So then that stops your entire evening being eaten by one.
So the thing that they did with 2nd edition Werewolf, which I think is really cool, is that the central thing with Werewolf has always been this idea of rage, that werewolves as entities are creatures who live with a permanent low-level rage, and it is always a risk that it'll overwhelm them. And so the two things they've done which are really interesting is that they've tweaked the morality tracker. So the morality tracker is a common thing in World of Darkness games. It usually keeps track of how human you are. The thing about werewolf is that your goal is to keep it bang in the middle. Yeah. You have to, because you are a creature of duality, you have to avoid yourself becoming too unhuman, but also avoid yourself becoming too human, or you'll start to lose access to your ability to understand the things that are going on around you. Yeah, so that's really neat. But the other thing that they have played with, which I find really interesting, is that they've created, they used to just have like fail a rage roll, frenzy, everything goes wrong. They've now got kind of 2 levels of frenzy. So there's a point where you can feel it coming on to you, but you're not there yet. And there's a point where you've completely lost it and you turn into your most terrifying form and murder everything you can see. And because there's that 2-level thing, you can kind of, there's this whole like risk reward thing about surfing the wave of it, but also it's now contagious because werewolves are pack animals. So if one person hits this like first heightened state, everybody else starts to go, smells like it's murder time. And there's this whole kind of dynamic about trying to control this group of people who aren't really people, and keep them in a state where they can function. I am looking forward to gaming that out.
Yeah, no, I mean, because this is, again, right, this is the recommendation. There are all of these fabulous ideas contained within these games, and I think those ideas are often what grab people and hold people in. Even going back to Vampire, like, because there are about 7 or so basic clans, and again, they are the ones who are fascinated by beauty, the ones who are eternal rebels, the ones who are giving up human society and decided to become beasts, the ones who are Nosferatu, the thing from the movie, and therefore are hideous and must hide into darkness. The ones who are entranced by beauty, the ones who are cursed by madness or truth, who knows? And like, just because each of those things, people who are minded to tell stories have heard those and gone, oh, that sounds cool. I've got an idea. And that's, I think, the power, right? And always has been.
So we are actually at time pretty much. I guess now is the time to do the 2 things that we suggest, do the 2 things I like to do at the end by way of wrapping things up. The first is if people are interested in the World of Darkness or were into it and then went off it for various reasons, and might be keen to find their way back in, where would you suggest they go? What would you suggest they look at?
I would look at, so the big thing to look at would be a recorded playthrough, a podcast of people actually playing Vampire called LA by Night, which is, I've forgotten whom started it off, but it got taken up by the World of Darkness YouTube channel. But if you search the YouTube for LA by Night, you'll find it, and that's very good, and gives you a good kind of, it's very theatrical, so it's a kind of like a radio play with occasional dice rolling, and so it's very captivating and very easy to listen to. I will throw an extra plug in there from my favorite nerds on the internet, Loading Ready Run, who are responsible for Not a Drop to Drink. So they have just started a vampire campaign in their role-playing stream, and that's really worth watching as well, because the person running that has written for World of Darkness, and is, again, very good. Yeah.
Excellent. So I guess my pitches would be, if you want to understand the darkly beautiful vibe, do check out Hannibal if you have Netflix. If you have the stomach for looking at a lot of murders, they are very, very pretty murders, and the way that they walk that line and get you to a point where where you're willing to buy into this strange world where there are just an implausible number of very artistic serial killers. It's great. Don't take it in any way seriously. Just know that it's taking itself far too seriously, and that's part of the appeal. Yes. Also, if you're interested in the role-playing games as radio thing, there are a couple of different non-World of Darkness things I would pitch you. If you would like to hear like goofy hijinks and Kiwi accents, look up all of the Diceratops stuff. That's run by a guy called Morgan Davey, or known on the internet as Morg. It's Dungeons and Dragons, so it's wacky fantasy hijinks, but it's done with New Zealand comedians, so you get to hear Kiwi accents, which is always nice. I would also recommend Fun City / Float City, which is the guy from Idea Channel, if you ever watched Idea Channel, running first Shadowrun, and then when the pandemic bit, running a currently unpublished game called Stillfleet, which is a very far future space thing. And that's done very much in the kind of improvisational theatre mold. But the cool thing about it is, particularly with Shadowrun, but they also do it with Stillfleet, they kind of unpack what's happening systemically at the same time, which is a really interesting way of like understanding why things happen in a particular way, or why the players might be making certain decisions or doing certain things. And it's very, very approachable because the people he's got as players are top flight stuff.
Yep.
So, final thing, plug anything you have to plug.
I don't really have anything to plug, though I have a project that might kick off at some point soon called Dude, Where's My Dystopia?
Yes.
Where I will try and hunt some people down to talk about their favorite dystopias and why they might be happening or might not be happening, and why that's probably to do with capitalism, probably.
So ears peeled on the internet for that.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Otherwise, as I say at work, please pull your mask up over your nose and wash your hands.
You've been listening to Reserved Recommendations, a radio show and podcast from Manawatu People's Radio, Te Reo Irirangi o ngā tangata o Manawatu. The show is produced and presented by me, Hugh Dingwall, and I also composed our theme music. It's called Sack Jazz, and you can find it at wolfboy.bandcamp.com. You can find me on the internet at Objective Realty on Twitter, and you can find the show on Facebook under Reserved Recommendations. If you've got a reserved recommendation of your own, feel free to pitch it to me in either of those two places. And if you enjoyed the show, why not go ahead and recommend it to a friend? You can find past episodes at www.mpr.nz/show/reserved on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. And remember, Manawatu People's Radio is a non-profit radio station. If you enjoy this or any of their other fine audio programming, why not fling them a couple of dollars? Go to mpr.nz/donate for more information.